This video was brought to you by NordVPN. As the war in Ukraine enters its second year with no resolution in sight, both Western and Ukrainian politicians are getting increasingly anxious about the prospect of Ukraine fatigue. A couple of months ago, Sweden's foreign minister told the New York Times that the media's interest is going down, and this is also affecting the public, and the public is affecting the politicians. And Zelensky himself acknowledged this in June, when he admitted that the fatigue is growing and people want some kind of outcome, but warned that this is all part of Putin's attritional strategy to wear down the West. Western politicians are clearly wary of straining their public's patience. Both Macron and Biden apparently told Zelensky privately that Ukraine might have to cede territory to accelerate the war's conclusion. And a few politicians, most notably the so-called Freedom Caucus of Republicans in the US House of Representatives, have explicitly questioned whether the West is doing the right thing in supporting Ukraine. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at whether Ukraine fatigue is a real phenomenon, whether Western support for Ukraine is actually waning, and what Western politicians should do about it. So let's get straight into it. Is Ukraine fatigue real? Well, the short answer, at least in Europe, is no, not really. Polling actually suggests that European support for Ukraine is relatively stable. Polling by Ipsos found that the fraction of Brits in favour of sending army and money to Ukraine is pretty much stable at about 60%. And while support for sanctions decreased in October as fears about rising energy prices kicked in, it's still higher than it was in February. Polling by ZDF in Germany from September found that support for Ukraine amongst Germans has actually increased, with 74% in favour of continued aid to Ukraine compared to 71% in August and 70% in July. Similarly, a massive Eurobarometer poll of 27,000 EU citizens from November found that 74% approved of EU support for Ukraine, including majorities of over 90% in Portugal, Ireland, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden and Finland. Now, there are exceptions. That same Eurobarometer poll found that less than half of Bulgarians, Cypriots, Slovakians and Greeks were in favour of EU support for Ukraine. But for the most part, support for Ukraine has remained steady, and large majorities in most European countries want their governments to continue support. This is probably why most European politicians are still firmly in favour of supporting Ukraine. Since it was reported that he was pressuring Zelensky into territorial concessions, Macron has publicly declared full support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. And last week, the Elysée announced that France would be sending armoured vehicles to the country. Those politicians that have come out against Ukraine have usually been punished at the ballot box. The Five Star Movement in Italy, for example, brought down the Draghi government because of a wing of the party opposed arms shipments to Ukraine, but lost badly to the right-wing coalition led by Giorgia Meloni's FDI, who are staunchly pro-NATO and pro-Ukraine. However, while Ukraine fatigue hasn't hit Europe, in the US things are a bit more complicated. While polling suggests that about 2/3 of Americans are still in favour of supporting Ukraine, enthusiasm among Republicans is apparently waning. Polling by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs from December, for example, found that 75% of Americans were in favour of increasing sanctions on Russia. 65% were in favour of sending military aid, 66% were in favour of sending economic aid, and 73% were in favour of accepting Ukrainian refugees. When they first asked this question back in March, there was basically no difference between Democrats and Republicans. At the time, for example, 83% of Democrats and 80% of Republicans supported military aid, and 85% of Democrats and 74% of Republicans supported economic aid. However, in the 9 months since, a partisan divide has appeared, with only 50% of Republicans in support of economic aid to Ukraine, compared to 81% of Democrats, and only 55% in support of military aid, compared to 76% of Democrats. Republicans now have less patience for a protracted conflict. 46% think the US should lobby Ukraine for a peace settlement as soon as possible, even if that means ceding territory to Russia, compared to 29% of Democrats. Similarly, Democrats are far more willing to suffer costs for Ukraine. 69% of Democrats think the US should support Ukraine for as long as it takes, even if that means higher prices, compared to 50% of Republicans. Polling elsewhere has found similar results. The Wall Street Journal and Pew Polling have found that the fraction of Republicans who think the US is doing too much for Ukraine has risen from 6% in March to 48% today. A YouGov CBS News poll from just a few days ago found that, for the first time since the war began, a majority of Republicans now oppose aid to Ukraine. Now, it's important not to overstate this. A majority of Americans still support sending aid to Ukraine, and while some House Republicans have come out against Ukraine, they're in the minority. Most Republican congresspeople are broadly in favour of Ukraine, and avidly anti-Ukraine candidates, who are often also pro-Trump, fared badly at the midterms. It's also worth saying that the vast majority of Democrat voters and politicians still support aid to Ukraine, which means that aid will probably continue to flow until at least 2024. Biden has just announced the US's largest support package yet, including Bradley armoured vehicles, and the US Army is about to start training Ukrainians to use their Patriot air defence systems. Even if Republicans win in 2024, halting support is probably not a good idea, because while Americans don't like a protracted war, they like losing even less. This is what happened in both Iraq and Afghanistan. A majority of Americans favoured withdrawal, but both Obama and Biden were widely criticised when the Islamic State and the Taliban respectively took over. It's also worth saying that, as America's economic prospects improve and inflation subsides, Americans might become a bit more relaxed about sending aid to Ukraine. This is also true in Europe. A warm winter and falling oil and gas prices have made Europeans more pro-Ukraine, because, well, supporting Ukraine no longer requires Europeans to freeze this winter. Nonetheless, the fact that Ukraine is becoming a partisan issue in America should worry Kyiv, because if there's one thing Republicans are good at, it's obstructionism. It's also bad news for anyone who cares about the functioning of America's political system. The fact that everything, including Ukraine, eventually becomes a partisan issue doesn't bode well for American democracy. So what should pro-Ukraine politicians do about this? Well, the main thing is to make sure Ukraine has the upper hand. People are more likely to support Ukraine if they think Ukraine is winning, and polling bears this out. Polling by the Chicago Center for Global Affairs found that a 71% majority of Americans who think Ukraine has an advantage think they should support Ukraine for as long as it takes, while a 60% majority of those who think Russia has the advantage want the US to pressure Ukraine to settle for peace. To be clear, we're not suggesting the West just give Ukraine every weapon system it asks for, and it's important not to be dismissive of the risk of escalation here. But the polling does suggest that the best way to cure Ukraine fatigue is to convince Western electorates that Ukraine is indeed winning, and that their aid makes a difference. With things like this continuing into 2023, it's easy to feel that the world is an increasingly unsafe place. Fortunately, when it comes to your personal life and digital safety, NordVPN has your back. It's an unfortunate reality that online scams and phishing attacks are on the rise right now, with us getting bombarded by emails from our banks, social media accounts, and even annoying newsletters we forgot we even signed up to. It's easy to click the wrong thing. One weak link can compromise security and bring things crashing down. With the protection of NordVPN, though, you can use their threat protection features to identify potentially suspicious links. Even if you did reach a suspicious website, NordVPN's data encryption tools would protect against a number of other attacks like malicious man-in-the-middle breaches. Even if things do go wrong, NordVPN's dark web monitoring is always scanning for your details and passwords, and can actively notify you before you even notice. It's easy to think that it won't happen to you, or that you won't be fooled, but these scams are pretty subtle, and when we see even massive firms falling for it, it's worth protecting yourself as much as you can. So click the link in the description or go to nordvpn.com/TLDR to get a huge discount on their 2-year plan. And with their 30-day money-back guarantee, you've got nothing to lose. Thanks for your support, and make sure to click the link in the description.